All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Mormon Interpreter Foundation, Interpreter Foundation, Scripture Roundtable. Today we are doing the Book of Mormon, Gospel Doctrine, Sunday School lesson number 5. We'll be covering 1 Nephi, chapters 16 through 22. My name is Cassandra Hedelius. I am moderating today, and joining me are these amiable and knowledgeable gentlemen. We have Jeff Bradshaw and Dan Peterson and Stephen Smoot. And break out your scriptures, open to 1 Nephi. There will be a lot of great stuff tonight. This is one of the just classic lessons that takes you back to your primary days with Nephi and his bow and building the ship and everything you sing about in the song. It just wonderful history here and wonderful applications. So let's get started. Jeff, do you want to start us off with background?
Sure. I think the most significant background here is just understanding something about the purpose of Nephi's writing of this book. And obviously, we've had a few previous lessons on the small plates of Nephi, first Nephi. But I'd like to just back up a little bit and think about what's really unique both in content and in structure about these two books. With respect to content, of course, we run into in Chapter 9 the idea that these plates are a record of the ministry of his people. And then in 2 Nephi 4, he expands on that and says it's really the things of his soul, and he rhapsodizes about his delight in the Scriptures, reading the Scriptures and pondering them and writing them. As far as the structure goes, it's somewhat interesting because we know that these weren't written as he went along, as it were, but he originally kept the larger plates and then later on was commanded specifically to write on a record containing the more spiritual aspects of his ministry. And what is interesting about that is he took great care, evidently, to structure the account in a way that would leverage in a maximally useful way all the literary power and ability that's out there. And to me, it just sings of the inspiration when you read it. It's certainly not something written by the young Joseph Smith whole cloth. Two proposals about the structure of 1 and 2 Nephi have been made. First proposal is by Noel Reynolds, who really did a beautiful and brilliant article back in 1982. Actually, there may have been a publication before the book chapter that he wrote. And he argued that Nephi and Lehi's accounts are basically parallel in 1 Nephi. You have 1 Nephi 1 through 9, which is Lehi's story, 10 through 22, which is Nephi's story. And then within those parallel accounts are many different chiasms, where you work from the outside in and from the inside out. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last, in a very large-minded way. And then he says about 2 Nephi, by way of contrast, that it's quote, a collection of odds and ends, with its only unifying feature being the thematic emphasis on redemption and general aim at a higher or more spiritually receptive audience than Layman and Lemuel. Now, there's a more recent proposal I want to highlight because many people may not have heard about it, that I think builds on Reynolds' ideas, but it's by Grant Hardy. And his alternative is based on the original chapter divisions. And what's interesting about it is he accounts for 1st and 2nd Nephi having a very parallel structure to each other. In other words, he's saying that 2nd Nephi, no more than 1st Nephi was, is not just a random collection of doctrinal teachings, but something that was very carefully crafted by Nephi. And so in both cases, we have Lehi's teachings, his conclusions, a response by Nephi, accounts of his brother's rebellion, and then preaching, some Isaiah chapters, and then Nephi's prophetic expansion. And so we have in both cases just beautifully structured sermons that I think we need to delve into and understand for the similarities and differences across the accounts. But regardless of whether or not these proposals or some of their elements you might accept, I think the real lesson here is that Nephi is in fulfilling his commandment faithfully to write this record, this very spiritual record that for a wise purpose in the Lord was eventually included in the Book of Mormon. he used every power he had available to them to be faithful to this commandment by being very careful in structuring his message, just like he was so obedient in everything else he did. And we find both great examples of immediate blessings of obedience in personal lives and in the long-term fulfillment of the Lord's promises for the righteous remnants of Israel and the Gentiles in the great prophecies that he gives within them.
Great. Great. Thank you very much, Jeff. Stephen or Dan, did you want to add anything to that?
No.
Okay. Then let's move on. Chapter 16. So in the narrative right now, Lehi and his family are in the wilderness. They went back to get Ishmael and his family, and most particularly his daughters. And they are, let's see, verse 7. Nephi took one of the daughters of Ishmael to wife, and my brethren took the daughters of Ishmael to wife, and also Zoram took the eldest daughter of Ishmael to wife. And thus my father had fulfilled the commandments of the Lord which had been given unto him, and also I, Nephi, had been blessed by the Lord exceedingly. Aww. So this is important. It is very good to not go into the wilderness without any way to keep your little colony population going. So that is one tactical consideration. The other consideration is lineage. When they went back and got the brass plates, they realized that they were descendants of Manasseh, and then they went back and got Ishmael, who was a descendant of Ephraim. And I believe there is some symbolic value to that. Stephen or Jeff, did you have thoughts there?
Well, one thing I'll mention that is kind of interesting, and you have to be kind of careful because this is a second-hand, well, it's a hearsay account. So Erastus Snow has a statement that he makes in the 1860s, I want to say. He's giving this sermon about the Book of Mormon, and he gets on the topic of the 116 lost pages that contain the Book of Lehi. And he's talking about something that Joseph Smith had told him was apparently in the Book of Lehi, in the 116 pages. And Erastus Snow says, you know, Joseph Smith told me that in the 116 pages it identifies Ishmael as an Ephraimite. And this may have significance. Now, again, you have to be careful because this is, you know, secondhand, right? This is Erastus Snow saying, well, I heard Joseph Smith say that this was in it. But, you know, if there's something to it, it's kind of interesting that there may be something to it in that, you know, we have Manasseites and Ephraimites that are going to have descendants in the New World. We're going to have the perpetuation of Joseph's descendants, from both of his children, going on in the New World. And you'll recall, of course, the big significance that Nephi and others play, especially beginning in 2 Nephi, I think it's like Nephi 5 or 6, where we have the prophecy of Joseph and the prophecy of what will happen to his seed and how his seed will write a record, and it will come together with the record of the Jews, and they will confound false doctrine. And, you know, he's clearly talking about the Book of Mormon. So there may be some significance there, just as we're talking about, you know, lineages and families. The fact that Ishmael may have been an Ephraimite, may have had, you know, Ephraimite ancestry, and that may have played a significant role later on for the Book of Mormon peoples as they perpetuate Joseph's lineage and Joseph's seed in the New World.
Thank you very much. Any more thoughts on that?
You know, I'll just mention that there's an interesting reference to some of Lehi's daughters in 2 Nephi 5:6, and according to Brother Snow too, Elder Snow, if we take that, those daughters married Ishmael's sons, and so really we've got sons and daughters all around the camp, brothers and sisters, which is a very interesting situation if indeed this account is true. I guess I want to comment on that commandment as well, fulfilling all the commandments. This is apparently the end of all the commandments, the end of the ones that Nephi fulfilled. You'll see later on Nephi is continuing his story with the commandments that he's fulfilling one by one. But Lehi, after these remaining intermarriages of the families in verse 8, is said that he's fulfilled all the commandments of the Lord. And we go back, and the first one was to flee Jerusalem. The second one in chapter 5 was the commandment to attain the brass plates. And the third one was to bring Ishmael and his family into the wilderness. And I guess implicitly the marriage could have been part of that. But again, Nephi's message is very clear. on obedience of his father, and then in a parallel way his own obedience, which is a beautiful lesson for each of us.
Mhm.
Great, thank you. And so still in chapter 16, let's see, going on to verse 9, the voice of the Lord speaks to Lehi in the night, commands him that tomorrow you take your journey into the wilderness. So they have left Jerusalem, they've got their brass plates, they've got their wives and husbands, they are finally ready to make the big trip. But first they need one more thing. So verse 10, as it came to pass, as they arose in the morning, Lehi went to his tent door. To his great astonishment, he beheld upon the ground a ball of curious workmanship, made of fine brass. There are 2 spindles. One pointed the way whither we should go into the wilderness. So this is, of course, the Liahona, which has amazing, potent, significant value both for them immediately to guide them in the wilderness, and then symbolic value for the rest of the Book of Mormon and for us. So a lot that we can say about this. First of all, there are 2 spindles. The verse says what one of the spindles does.
Mhm.
What's up with that other spindle?
There's been speculation about this. Hugh Nibley connected it with ancient Arabian arrow divination. But who knows? That's speculative. We really don't know how this works. But you know, the term is used for it, compass. But I think people need to understand this is not a compass in the sense that we normally understand a compass. I've seen people say, "Oh no, the compass was discovered by the Chinese and it postdates this." Well, this is not an ordinary compass. It ceases functioning when you're unrighteous. My Boy Scout compass didn't do that. I could be a complete jerk and my compass still worked. So this is not the ordinary magnetic kind of compass, and my Scout compass didn't have writing that appeared on it telling me what to do and exhorting me to moral improvement and so on. So there's something very different about this. It's a compass in the sense that it points directions, but it's not a compass in the sense that you can go and buy at a sporting goods store. So the date of Chinese discovery of magnetic compasses is really irrelevant to this. But it's clearly something they kind of know how to use. It's related in some way to something they know, so it could be this arrow divination idea or something of that sort.
There's an interesting account by Robert Bunker, who was an engineer, and he thought, it says that one of the air spindles was supposed to be pointing to the direction, and what's the other one supposed to do? And his theory as an engineer, again, it's just the theory like Dan was saying, is that the other one was to indicate whether the device was working. So if you find the 2 arrows crosswise, something's out of whack, your faith has failed. You find them both pointing in the same direction, you have an indication that you're on track.
Yeah, otherwise, a single arrow would always be pointing somewhere. And you might conclude, oh, that's the direction we're supposed to go. Well, it might just not be working. It's just pointing in a random direction, and off you go. And remember, this kind of landscape, if you go the wrong way, you die. Because we're talking about the Arabian desert here, where there's no water. I mean, if you've seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, you know that knowing where the watering holes are is really, really important. And you can die if you miss them. And you miss them by a mile, you might as well miss them by 100 miles. You're going to die. So you've got to have either a guide, a human guide who knows the territory, or something that's going to get you around. And then you've got to be able to rely on it. If you go the wrong direction very long, you're doomed.
And then Jeff or Stephen, you guys had some thoughts about the parallels between the Liahona and manna and the children of Israel, their previous journey in the wilderness.
Well, if I could just say something quickly on that, it seems really clear, and there's been a lot written about this, that Nephi is sort of recapturing the Exodus with his own account of what the family is doing. So he's going to introduce themes and motifs and ideas that are also found in the Exodus story. He's going to basically take himself and his family and put them in the position of Moses and the children of Israel, and it's their own little personal Exodus. And one of the things that we have, and of course in the Exodus, is this idea of manna that the Israelites find every morning except for on the Sabbath, and they're supposed to gather it, and they're supposed to use that for food, right? And it's this miraculous sort of event that is supposed to save the Israelites. And the compass, or the Liahona, one of the things that they use it for is to find food, right? It helps them not just only travel, but it helps them find food. I'm trying to think of which verse that's in. I think it's in this chapter, but I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to look for it.
Well, the verse 16
but I
about
do recall
following the directions leading us to the most fertile parts of the wilderness.
And
there you go.
Nephi
Perfect.
goes after his bow breaks. He's also led by the Liahona to go find some game.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so we have the Liahona acting as the miraculous agent that saves them by giving them food and nourishment and sustenance. And so there is a parallel there. The Liahona takes the part of the manna. And remember the circumstances of how they find it, right? It just sort of miraculously shows up one morning on Lehi's door, right, to his tent. And so it's clearly something miraculous. It's clearly something otherworldly, supernatural, and it's ultimately beneficial to them. So I think that we do see a parallel there, and I think this is deliberate. I think Nephi is deliberately trying to say we were like the children of Israel, and the Liahona was our manna, and that it led us to food and nourishment.
Yeah, I mean, he makes explicit comparisons to Moses in a little while about the children of Israel being delivered and so on because they were obedient, because they paid attention to what God told them. He has the Exodus in his mind, and the Exodus, of course, was the great event in the history of ancient Israel. They're always going back to it, remembering it, commemorating it at the Passover, meditating on it, reflecting on it. And that's also one of the areas of distinction, again, between the Liahona and a compass. A compass may point you north, but it's not going to tell you where to go find food.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that keeping the Exodus in mind was very important for them motivationally too, that when we look back on this, when we have this neatly packaged account in a few chapters, and we can clearly see that yes, the Lord was leading them along, but from their perspective, I mean at this point they were striking out into the real wilderness part of their journey. As Dan pointed out, this is not a easy little stroll. This is forbidding terrain that could easily kill you. And I mean, we move forward a few more verses. Nephi breaks his bow, and instead of
something else,
hang on really quick, just that instead of saying, well, it's okay, the Lord is leading us along, and we'll tell our grandchildren about this and how it was just like the Exodus. Instead, in verse 20, they all start to murmur, and their sufferings and their afflictions are so great, and it would have been very easy at the time to not see it in the context of the Lord is leading us along, but instead we're going to die in the wilderness. So I would think that trying to keep that in mind, that the Lord is leading us. This is just like the Exodus. The Lord will preserve us. Would have been very important. Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
The murmuring itself, by the way, really quickly, is related to the Exodus motif as well. The children of Israel do a bit of that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ironically, Laman and Lemuel are fulfilling that parallel, aren't they? I think Don. I just want to mention Don Bradley's brilliant work, which he summarized in the 2012 Fair Conference, which hopefully will be part of his upcoming thesis and book, where he points out a couple of interesting temple-related parallels with the manna and the Liahona. First of all, it's interesting that the way the Liahona was found, just like the manna, is Lehi came out of his tent in the morning and saw this small round thing, and what did the children of Israel do? They came out of their tents in the morning and found small round things, namely the manna. They called it the strange name of manna because they couldn't figure out what it was. In the same way, we have this uninterpretable name. Well, maybe people have conjectures about what it means, but this thing of curious workmanship that they didn't know quite what to make of it in the beginning. So the finding itself is pointing you to that and the wording that's used. But I think even more interesting for me, because I'm always interested in the temple angles in these things, is that both the manna and the Liahona were among the objects that were placed in, the manna was one of the objects placed in the Ark of the Covenant, along with other symbols of the Lord's goodness to them. And in a similar way, there are parallels between every object, including, in this case, the Liahona, that were placed in the stone box that where Joseph Smith discovered the Book of Mormon plates. So it's interesting. We have not only, I guess, parallels in the use of the Liahona and the manna in the desert, but also how they were memorialized in the temple symbolism of those tokens of the Lord's goodness for them in the stone box and in the Ark of the Covenant.
Oh, very interesting point. Thank you. And then really quick, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, going back to verse 13, talking a little bit about their journey, and some scholars have tracked all of this, the directions that are in the narrative here, and how that maps out onto what we presently know about the Arabian Peninsula. But we did pitch our tents again, and we did call the name of the place Shazer. So Jeff or Stephen, you had some thoughts about that name.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, as you'll see in your footnote, it possibly comes from the Hebrew root shazar, to twist or to weave. It typically has the sense, as I recall, as I understand, it has a sense of like weaving fabric, but I suppose it's possible that they saw some of the trees, right? Some of these twisting trees. What would they be? Acacia wood or something? Some of these, native trees to the Arabian Peninsula with these twisting branches. And so they say, oh, look, it looks like what you do when you weave in fabric, right? So they call it this place. I also know that Hugh Nibley has tried to sort of find Arabic etymologies for this place. That's, of course, Dan's field of expertise, the Arabic. But it is a plausible Hebrew etymology. And even though it's kind of odd because it doesn't necessarily mean twisting in the sense of like, a tree or something, it's more fabric. I can still see, the family coming across some place and seeing the twisting acacia trees and say, oh, look, Shazer, right? And they call it that sort of, because it kind of reminds them of it. But I don't know if Dan has a comment on any of the Arabic possible etymologies or anything like that.
Yeah, one word that I've seen people try to connect it with is the word shajar, which would be S-H-A-J-E-R, which means tree.
Okay. Yeah.
So it could be something, twisting, intertwined, and tree. Both those ideas being in the back of a mind.
Yeah.
Maybe even a bilingual pun.
Sure.
Who knows?
And again, I think there's a plausible geographic setting there. At least I really go along for this part of the journey, at least, with George Potter and Richard Wellington in the setting of the Valley of Lemuel, and then going on, they found, to my mind, a very plausible place, a valley full of trees and mountains and good hunting, and nearby, really the east side of the mountain range there, the borders, as they're often called in Book of Mormon language, where there were more fertile parts. And the way they describe it is that there's a whole pearl-like chain of villages and cultivated lands that are surrounded by thousands of square miles of barren terrain along this area of the Frankincense Trail. Just one aside, in a little bit further north on the Frankincense Trail, near the border of Saudi Arabia, near the north end of Saudi Arabia, near the border of Jordan, I was in the area of Al-Ula once, and I didn't go up to see it, but the locals all told me I needed to go up to the cliffs and see some of the rock paintings on the walls, because they said they contain camels, horses, cows, goats, giraffes, ibex, ostriches, and even lions and cheetahs. Here we were in the middle of this barren desert, and there was game abundantly at some time in the past, and as I think most would agree, maybe Dan or Stephen, you know more, but it was a very jungle-like place at one time, and certainly there was plenty of game in this area in earlier times than ours.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. All right, let's go back forward to where we left off the narrative before, still in chapter 16, verse 18. Nephi went forth to slay food, but he broke his bow, which was made of fine steel, and his brethren were angry with him, not only because he had broken his bow, but because their bows had lost their spring. So what's going on? Why is everybody's bow breaking all of a sudden?
Well, I can't speak to why their bows are breaking because I'm not much of a bowman myself, but I can say
You don't have
that
bow skills?
What's that?
Bow hunting skills? So
Yeah,
you don't have
no,
them?
not really. I'm a city slicker, right? Not really
Ah,
my thing.
okay.
Archery or that sort of thing. But I can say for the longest time, and you still hear today, this idea that steel, because Nephi says he has a bow of fine steel, that this is an anachronism, right? This is Joseph Smith being clumsy and doesn't realize that this is, steel didn't exist until the modern era. As a matter of fact, now we know that steel is not an anachronism in First Nephi. We have artifacts, steel artifacts, carburized iron artifacts that have survived clear back in like the 10th century BC. We have a couple of picks, for example. They discovered steel picks, about that big or so, that they discovered in Galilee. And we have a sword from, I want to say, about the 7th or 6th century that is carburized iron or steel. And so there's really no controversy anymore. It's pretty clear that they had metal, Israelites, ancient Israelites, had the metallurgical skills to carburize iron into steel. It's not exactly like modern steel, we think of like stainless steel today, but it's for all intents and purposes steel, and that's what it's called, and that's how it's classified by mainstream archaeologists. And so, a nice little vindication there for the Book of Mormon. The whole issue with metals in the New World is a whole other deal, but at least for First Nephi's sake, this isn't an anachronism. It's now it's pretty safe that we know they had steel by this point.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And then Jeff, you had some other insights into why these bows might have been breaking.
Yeah, Bill Hamlin's written a great article in I think it's in the volume Warfare and the Book of Mormon, that explains what a steel bow was. Till I read Bill's article, I guess I always imagined it being solid steel. Actually, when I was younger, of course, I didn't realize that steel remnants had been found, as Stephen shared with us. But actually, he says it's wood covered in steel, and particularly in some of the more crucial parts of the bow. And so what happens when you move from one climate to the other is, if you're not watching carefully, the wood will start to warp, the steel will not warp, and you're going to have a bow that breaks because the steel and the wood get out of alignment. And so they could blame Nephi. You say, why do they blame him for the bow breaking? Well, I could hear Layman Lemuel saying, well, if you were watching the bow more carefully, you would have seen that it was doing some side warping here, and he would have done something about it. What he could have done, I'm not sure, but I could see some element of blame being raised by Layman and Lemuel there. Interestingly enough, too, obviously when you move to a different climate, the bows may lose their spring in a similar way. And so Nephi makes a bow of some of the local wood, whether it's, I forgot some of the different proposals. Some people said it was olive wood, in fact, I remember. But you've got to make a new arrow, too, which the text specifically says he does. He doesn't just use the old steel bow arrows. It specifically says he makes a new arrow for the new bow. Not being a bowman myself, I was grateful to learn from Bill Hamlin also. Those two things have to be matched. It would drop like a telephone pole, one of those steel bow arrows, if you tried to shoot it with your wooden bow, his replacement bow. So that's pretty cool bullseye for the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, the climate does change in some of these areas. You get in some of the coastal regions, it can be extremely humid. You might not think that would be so in a desert. It's a salty humidity around places like Jeddah and so on that. So the climate can change from, if you're coming from Jerusalem, which is high and semi-arid, and then being down in the coasts where it could be very muggy and so on, as it can be around the Gulf too, then that would have an impact on something made out of wood.
All right. Yeah, and just a thought too, I wonder if Nephi wasn't paying sufficient attention to his bow, both because he didn't expect the climate to change so much, and also because his bow hunting skills might not have been the best in the world. These were city kids. They grew up in Jerusalem and might not have had to hunt for their food every day. They were still getting used to this whole thing.
Well, and he's a newlywed too. He's distracted.
Right. Women will do that. Uh-oh, did we lose Stephen? Okay. All right, so then moving forward again, we have Nephi makes a new bow. Everybody is murmuring except for Nephi, apparently. Well, we don't really know about the women. I said this before in another roundtable, but I really look forward to some millennial or celestial day when perhaps historians can interview and talk to the women involved in all of this, and we can get more history. But so most of the major players here are murmuring. They are afraid that they are all going to die in the wilderness because they don't have bows, they can't get food. Nephi stays faithful. Verse 23, instead of kind of using that, using his faith and their murmuring to prop himself up as being better than them, he goes to his father and says, "Where shall I go to obtain food?" Lehi humbles himself, inquires of the Lord, and they're able to get back on track. Nephi finds food. Okay, so moving forward then, verse 33, they are going to take their journey again, nearly the same course as in the beginning. They traveled for the space of many days. Ishmael dies and is buried in the place that was called Nahum. And this is a name that has been talked about quite a lot by faithful scholars of the Book of Mormon, because it has a really cool correspondence with what we know even today about that area. So who wants to talk about Nahum?
Well, I have a lot I could say, but I'll let Jeff or Dan say anything if they want to.
Didn't you write an article on Nahum at some point?
Go for it, Stephen. They can mop up afterward.
Okay, well, yes, Neil Rapley, my friend Neil Rapley and I co-wrote a paper that got published by Interpreter, and it's addressing the issue of Nahum, and we were specifically addressing some of the common objections that are raised against the validity of Nahum as a verified Book of Mormon site. And there's a lot of literature that, to keep in mind, so I'll try to condense things really quick. But here's basically the significance of Nahum. Okay, number one, notice what they say. They say the place which was called Nahum. Everywhere else they call it. We called it this and we called it that. But when they arrived here, it was called that. Now, there might be nothing there, but Neil and I and others think that it's significant that this is in the passive voice, that it was called that. It seems to imply two things. Number one, it predates them. And number two, they came in contact with somebody that told them what it was called. If they were calling it Nahum, you think they would have said, and we called it Nahum, but it's not. They find out it's already been called that. So that's the first important thing. The second important thing about it is where they are, because right after they bury Ishmael at Nahum, Nephi says, we then went eastward, and we cut across, and we ended up in Bountiful, right? And so, okay, so we have a correlation with another geographical reference on where this might be. That's the second thing. And then the third thing is the name itself. The name itself, as your footnote mentions, it may very well come from the Hebrew root Naham, and it has the guttural chet, so Naham, meaning to console or to comfort. It can also mean to be sorry or to be sorrowful. And this works very well in the narrative because there's this nice little pun here, because what happens, it says, we went to this place called Nahum, in verse 35, and it came to pass that the daughters of Ishmael did mourn exceedingly because of the loss of their father, because of the afflictions in the wilderness. So there seems to be some kind of a pun or a play on words here of the name. Now, here's what's neat. We have archaeologically verified a site based both on some altars that were discovered in the region and on some other inscriptions that there was a place named, well, there was a tribe, the Nahum tribe, that existed west of Marib in what is now modern Yemen, and so we can correlate where they existed. We know they predated Lehi, this tribe, and we're pretty sure, based on conventions that survive even today, that the tribal name was also the name of the place, that it was the name of the region. And so maps, even up in Joseph Smith's day, recorded this as the Nahum region, variously spelled N-E-H-M, sometimes Nihim, N-I-H-H-M, or N-I-H-M, but it has the triconsonantal root N-H-M, and that's what really matters with these Semitic etymologies in Hebrew and in South Arabian and in Aramaic, and I'm pretty sure also in Arabic. Dan can correct me, but I think that's also the case. It's really the triconsonantal root for these things that really matters. So even if the vowels are different, it's still a match. So we have, in the Book of Mormon, the right time, the right place, the right context, the right name. And it fits really, really well. And so there's really good reason to believe that this is as close as an archaeologically verified Book of Mormon site as we're going to get. It fits all the criteria. It fits all of the evidence that we have. And to prove that this isn't just some cockamamie apologist scheme, right, and that we're just sort of crazy, I'm going to read something from an online critic. He was heavily criticizing the apologetic effort to link Nahum with Nehem. And he was basically, well, I won't get into what his whole argument was, but he had a very interesting omission or admission that he makes. He says this. He says, "We have seen above that the case for linking Nahum with South Arabia Nehem is reasonably strong. Even if Nahum reflects an incorrect valuing of Nehem, and we can quibble over that, a number of interlocking details suggest that the appearance of Nahum in the Book of Mormon rises to a level beyond what could be explained as mere coincidence, including, 1, the fact that there appears to be only one major tribe in this part of South Arabia attested from ancient to modern times, with the name built from the consonants NHM, Nehem. 2, the Book of Mormon places Nahum in the general vicinity of central Yemen, where Nehem is located, at a point where a route following southeast from northern Arabia could at least theoretically turn eastward and reach the coast of southern Oman." Remember Nephi, we go south and then we turn east to Bountiful on the coast. And 3, Nahum is portrayed as a pre-existing name which is unique in the context of the journey of Lehi's party from Jerusalem to Bountiful. Now this critic goes on to say that Joseph Smith basically was cribbing from these maps that were available in his day. And there were maps available in Joseph Smith's day that noted the location of this region. And so he says, well, see, Joseph Smith just sort of cribbed from these maps. But I think that's very unlikely. I think it's very unlikely that Joseph Smith just picked a random name. Some have said that Joseph Smith got the name from the Bible because we have the prophet Nahum, right, the biblical book of Nahum in the Bible, that Joseph Smith just sort of copied that. But I think that's unlikely for reasons that I explain in the paper I co-wrote with Neil. And so this is really quite awesome. Like, this is as strong as we're going to get, right? And so it's significant. It's confirmation, I think, of the Book of Mormon's historicity, and it's something that we can pretty confidently say is good evidence, archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. So the next time a critic says, well, there's no evidence for the Book of Mormon, there's no archaeological evidence for it, you can turn to Nahum, and you can point out that this is a pretty strong convergence, and it's something of a bullseye for Joseph Smith, I would say.
Excellent. Thank you. Jeff or Dan, anything to quickly add? Stephen was pretty thorough.
Well, looks like Dan's trying to talk, but it looks like his mic is off.
Dan, your mic is off.
I was coughing and forgot to. Okay, let me just say there was a film done a number of years ago that some people might still be interested in called Journey of Faith, which was actually filmed in the Arabian Peninsula. And if you want to see what the landscape looks like, including a discussion of this this place and so on, that's a good thing to look at. It should be, well, I don't know if it's very widely available anymore or not, but it has historically been in LDS bookstores and Deseret Book and elsewhere, called Journey of Faith.
I think it's online now, Dan.
Is it? Okay. It's filmed on location, much of it in Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula, so worth a look, I think.
Cool. Okay. All right, so to finish up chapter 16 here, I don't know exactly what the time frame would have been. It might have been a few months, but between the time when Nephi broke his bow and then miraculously was directed by the Liahona where to go to find food, and they were preserved after fearing that they would starve. Some probably not too long of a time later, Ishmael dies. They are sad, which is not surprising. But they also, verse 35, begin to murmur again against Lehi. Ishmael's daughters are saying, "Our father is dead. Yea, we have wandered much in the wilderness, and we have suffered much affliction, hunger, thirst, and fatigue. And after all these sufferings, we must perish in the wilderness with hunger." Laman and Lemuel, of course, get in on that act, not just murmuring, but along with the sons of Ishmael, planning to slay Lehi and Nephi. They're mad because they don't like being ruled over by Nephi. They don't like Nephi's claims that the Lord has talked to him and given him revelation and that angels have ministered to him. And so they're cooking up this plot. Verse 39, "The Lord was with us, and the Lord comes and speaks unto them and chastised them exceedingly. They did turn away their anger and repent of their sins, insomuch that the Lord and we did not perish. And so just thinking through this, what it would have been like to be there. Again, this idea that it wasn't this neatly packaged scriptural chapter for them. It was a long, tough journey in the wilderness. The Lord, when He is leading us along and giving us something to do, even though in retrospect it can be very clear that, yes, the Lord had it all taken care of. The Lord was leading you along, making sure everything was okay. But at the time, you're trudging through the wilderness, you don't have a lot to eat or drink, and you still have to make the choice to believe, have faith that the Lord is in charge, or to make the choice, as Laman and Lemuel and some of the others did, that no, this isn't, there's nothing helping us, this has nothing to do with God, this is just a foolish decision that foolish people have imposed on us. And so that just speaks to me. When we're going through our own afflictions and trials, we can choose to believe that it is something that the Lord knows what's going on. He knows that it's for our good. He's with us. He'll help us. It's still hard, but He is still with us. Or we can choose to murmur. Any other thoughts on chapter 16 before we move on to 17?
Well, I just want to say that when you have the description, very much in passing, that Laman says unto Lemuel and the sons of Ishmael, "Let us slay our father, and also our brother," but especially the father. If you want something that's going to immediately trigger in the minds of a lot of ancient peoples the judgment, these are evil men, it's the idea of patricide, the idea that they're going to kill their father. I mean, murder is wrong, but killing your father or your mother, but killing your father is just bottomless evil. So Nephi doesn't have to say much about how horrible this is. His audience would have immediately gotten it. This is something you just don't do. So it shows the depravity, the degree of wickedness to which Laman and Lemuel have progressed in this story.
I think, well, that's just interesting to me too. I mean, they do go to some lengths to try to justify it, that we need to kill him because he's making these cockamamie claims and saying the Lord has talked to him. But yeah, that's a very good point. They feel like they have to justify it. Okay, any other thoughts on chapter 16? If not, we're moving on to 17. All right, let's move on. Chapter 17 opens, they are still journeying in the wilderness. They journey eastward from that time forth, so you can kind of think about on the Arabian Peninsula, they've been going down, and now they're going kind of more sideways along the bottom edge of Oman and Yemen. Maybe I got the order of those two backwards. Or do they stay in one place? Anyone want to give us a quick map overview?
Well, Yemen is to the north of Oman is to the north of Yemen, and what they're apparently doing is they're skirting the mountains that sort of form the boundary between the rest of Arabia and Yemen. They're going behind those mountains over to the sea coast, so skirting the empty quarter, which is a really rough area in the Arabian Peninsula.
And for some reason, skirting the crowds. I mean, this would not have been the easiest way, as Dan implies. The Liahona is leading him now not in the most fertile parts of the wilderness, but hopefully in the ways they'll maybe avoid some enemies potentially.
Yeah, and I thought too that maybe Lehi didn't want to go into Yemen because there are people there, and after some time in the wilderness, Laman and Lemuel might say, okay, this is civilization, we're staying here. And he doesn't want to go in there. They might never get out. The spiritual dangers and other dangers of a place like Yemen, which was a center of settled population. That's South Arabia, where the old South Arabian language was and all that sort of thing. And it was, unlike the rest of Arabia, it wasn't a nomadic territory. They had settled terraced agriculture and settlements, even high-rise buildings and so on and so forth. And it might be dangerous to take Laman and Lemuel in particular into a place like that because they might just decide to stay. And of course, I've said before, in retrospect, would that have been so bad? But Lehi is a caring father, and he doesn't want to leave his sons there. He wants to save them. So he's not going to risk it. So you stay in the wilderness, skirt those dangerous populated areas.
If indeed the skyscrapers of Yemen were a model for some of the great and spacious buildings that Lehi saw in his dream, he would be literally leading them into the great spacious building, wouldn't he?
That's right. Yeah, and that's actually one of my speculations that that's a possible explanation of the building. At least he would have maybe had that in mind and thought, nope, we're not going there. We're not going to go back in any population centers until we get out of the old world.
So is that a reason why they might have been eating their meat raw instead of cooking it, because they didn't want to tip off the locals that they were
Yes.
there by building fires?
Yeah, there are areas of Arabia where, you're out in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing. There's no law and order, and if you're set upon by a group of brigands who did exist in these areas, always have, then you could be overpowered, and there'd be nobody to do anything about it, no one to help you. So by night, you don't want to light a fire. You don't want to attract their attention. Even by day, you don't want to send up a column of smoke into the air, but you don't want to be lighting a fire, which is kind of a homing beacon for robbers. Look, there's a group of campers out there, and we can see exactly where they are. Let's go raid them. Now, raiding was a time-honored tradition in the Arabian Peninsula in pre-Islamic times.
Okay. And so it's early in chapter 17, let's see, in verse 2 here, that it talks about that this is a tough journey, and the women are bearing children, and what do they have to live on while they are bearing children? Well, raw meat. And that's always sounded pretty gross to me, but now that I am a little ways into my own first pregnancy, oh my goodness, I cannot even tell you how revolting that sounds right now. So, but
let me say, by the way, there are traditional methods of doing raw meat and curing it so that it is actually edible. I can't say that I really like it, though I don't mind it too much, but there's a kind of meat, for example, in Egypt called basturma, which is probably related to pastrami, etymologically anyway, and it's a cured raw meat. At least in some cases, that's what it is. And so you could carry it with you in the wilderness, like jerky or something like that, in a way that you'd carry with you. Don't want to talk about this too long, Cassandra.
Yeah, sorry, that still sounds revolting, and I feel bad for those poor women. But it says that so great were the blessings of the Lord upon them, that the women were still able to bear their children safely and nourish the children. They were strong like unto the men, and they began to bear their journeyings without murmuring. So that's good. After having such a hard time when Ishmael died, they're starting to get the hang of this whole journeying in the wilderness thing. Let's see. Let's go on. Oh, sorry. So in verse 3, it talks about the sojourn in the wilderness, sojourn. Jeff, you had some thoughts about that, the 8 years in the wilderness.
Yeah, they were there 8 years, and I guess Kent Brown wrote an interesting article where he looked very carefully at the word sojourn and concluded that one of the meanings that could have been there is that they were actually in some kind of servitude, whether actually slaves or just beholden to the locals and having to be somewhat servile in being able to get through that dangerous territory safely. The 8 years, we don't know why it took so long to get there. Certainly under normal circumstances, it wouldn't have taken 8 years. Another reason that's given for maybe why the Lord didn't want to arrive any sooner is they needed a very strong current to get quickly to America. And so there's at least one Book of Mormon scholar who thinks that they had to catch a ride on El Nino during the monsoon season to make it safely and quickly to the New World. So we don't know all the story there. It wasn't central, apparently, to Nephi's purpose, so he just gave us a little bit of a hint as an afterthought, it seems like.
Very cool. And then in verse 5, going back to what Stephen was talking about with Nahum before, that it was what the locals called it, and to bolster that, now we're back to their convention that they came to the land which they called bountiful, and we beheld the sea which we called Iriantum. So let's talk about bountiful a little bit. It has a lot of fruit and wild honey, and there are good candidates that we know about today that are still there today for a place that they would have thought was bountiful.
Could I say? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just mention the two big candidates, and I think it's Warren Aston likes one, and then Potter likes the other one. There's Khor Rori and Khor Kafort, both on the coast there of the Arabian Sea. And they both have a lot going for them insofar as, the sorts of requirements here. I'm not particularly dogmatic about which one it has to be. It's also people, when Mormon scholars have sort of these ambiguities, nobody should freak out. This is really common with trying to locate ancient toponyms and ancient locations, right? Go to any archaeological area and you'll find plenty of candidates for some cities that we're just not quite sure. So we still have some work to do there. We're trying to figure out which one exactly it is. But the point is, you're right, Cassandra, just like Nahum and some of these other locations throughout Lehi's Trail, we have a pretty good, strong correlation going on here with some sites in southern Arabia along the Arabian coast. It's interesting that it's not just the honey and the fruit, but also the other requirements that the Bountiful needs to have cliffs, because you remember Nephi's brothers were going to chuck him off some cliffs, right? When they were upset with him. There has to be ore, right, to make the tools that Nephi is going to use, and there has to be timber for him to make the boat. And so, scholars are still debating which one exactly it is, but there's plenty of justification for saying that Bountiful was a real-world location, and that the Book of Mormon very accurately describes these locations, or one of these possible locations, in ancient southern Arabia. So it's another bullseye, I think, for the Book of Mormon. And again, correlating it back with Nahum, when you go east from what is now the modern Nehem region, I think now it's around Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. I believe it's around that region, or just maybe a little bit north of there. I can't recall. As you go due east from there, that's where you hit the coast. And so it's a nice little bullseye for the Book of Mormon because it has this convergence there. So they're going to set up camp and they're going to build a ship. It's going to take them a while to build the ship, we have to appreciate, right? Because building a ship is a big deal. But it's interesting that the Lord says, I'll construct in verse 8, "Thou shalt construct a ship after the manner which I shall show thee, that I may carry thy people across the waters." Right, and Nephi later says, the Lord, it wasn't built after the manner of men, it was built after this unique pattern the Lord had revealed. Jeff maybe wants to talk about this, but there's possible convergences there going back to Noah and the ark. I think we can also look at this again as the Exodus motif. They're going to cross through the waters and be delivered to the promised land, right? Be delivered out of danger. So you see more Exodus pattern stuff going on there. But yeah, I'll also mention, by the way, Iriantum has a plausible etymology. There's two possible etymologies for Iriantum, and it's interesting that Nephi gives a gloss. He says, which being interpreted is many waters. So this suggests that it's a word that wasn't either readily recognized by the family, or Nephi was afraid his readers wouldn't have recognized it, so he interpreted it. We're not quite sure why he gives the gloss. But for our purposes here, there's a possible Egyptian etymology for this, and there's also a possible South Arabian etymology for it. Robert Smith has favored the Egyptian etymology. Paul Hoskisson and myself favors the South Arabian etymology. But again, we have plausibility here, right? This is a plausibly historical ancient record, that these are ancient things that's being described here in 1 Nephi. And for Joseph Smith to get so many bullseyes one after the other, or to get very convincing, sort of, at the very least, very plausible convergences with the ancient world, I think is quite remarkable, especially here in 1 Nephi, where it's the strongest.
Yeah, and one thing is simply that for a lot of people, they just can't believe there was any land in any part of Arabia that could ever plausibly be called bountiful. It's not just a matter of trying to find a specific location, but the fact that there are places on the Arabian Sea coast that are actually fairly fertile, green with fresh water and all these other things. That's something most people haven't known. It's something that I doubt very much that Joseph Smith knew. But there you have it. That there even exists a place that could be plausibly considered a possibility is remarkable in its way as a bullseye.
Yeah, and I do want to build on that to say that there is only one place that fits that description, and I don't want to give the impression that the two places that Stephen mentioned are very far apart, which are the plausible places of the port. This region of Dhofar and the city there, that's the Al-Salalah, it's a big green thumbprint on the base of Saudi Arabia, and you look at a satellite map and you say, how did that ever get there? That's the only bountiful-like place you can see from a satellite anywhere in that entire peninsula, directly due east of Nahum, as he said. And I've seen scholars make a pretty convincing case that it definitely was not known in Joseph Smith's time, that particular region. I do want to say something about the trees there. I've been through that region, and I'm not convinced that any of the local trees could have been used for the ships. Just my view. There's two areas of controversy among scholars. One is the exact spot of the harbor, and the other is, how big was the ship? Did the ship need to be? Those who favor Cor Kafot tend to think about it being a smaller ship, because that harbor really couldn't admit a big one. It's an open beach-like area, fairly shallow and breaking waves. You couldn't launch a very big boat there, whereas Korori is an ancient harbor that's got, protected from the waves, and you could launch a deeper, bigger boat there. The theory that I favor, which I think has some plausible evidence, we won't go into any depth, is that is where there's evidence for timber being imported from India to that very spot. They found, big logs of teak and other places that could have come from nowhere else. And in looking at those twisty, gnarly, and really small trees, unless they all went in robot-sized craft, I'm pretty much convinced that this was an area of commerce and that they interacted with the locals and were able to manage to get some suitable timbers for crossing the ocean. And for that reason, I also think, there's estimates of 25 to 75 people going in the boat. I tend to favor the idea that it had to be the kind of large boat you'd find at Korori, or be able to launch at Korori.
So at this location that they are building the boat, we know that they need to have access to seaworthy wood, and then they also have to have access to ore. So still in chapter 17, let's see, just in verse 7, the Lord calls Nephi up into the mountain, reveals to him that he needs to construct a ship, and he'll show you how. Nephi asks him in verse 9, where do I go to find ore so that I can molten it and make tools to construct the ship? The Lord told him where to go, so it can't have been too far away, and I am guessing that these sites also have deposits of ore nearby that we know about.
They do. I remember when we sent some people over there, including a geologist from BYU, and I thought, oh no, he's going to do all sorts of sophisticated tests there to find whether there's ore or not. Well, his sophisticated test consisted basically of going into a dry creek bed, a wadi, taking out a magnet, a pocket magnet, sticking it in the sand, moving it around a little bit, pulling it out, and there are iron filings coming from it. And he says, yep, iron ore up the hills up there. I thought, that's it? I mean, I used to do that when I was a Boy Scout. And he says, well, if there's iron ore in the wadi, it washed down from somewhere. There's iron ore up there in the hills. That's definitive proof. Well, actually, logically, that's true. So yeah, there is iron ore up those hills to be found. You could do more work to try to find specific large deposits, but it's there.
Under the surface, in a chemical form that was easy to gather up and just break off with your hands. He did find some upstream evidence, as I recall.
Yeah.
What they didn't find, though, was any evidence of smelting. And on one of my trips there, that's what I went looking for. And the supervisor of excavations there at Korori, again, another reason why I like that site, finally said, you know what we found this time? He says, we found some slag that is evidence of smelting here at Korori. It doesn't go quite back to Lehi's time. It just goes from about 300 to 150 BC. But it shows that ore was of a quality that you could actually do some smelting and build some tools. Yeah. Another magnificent target, a bullseye for Joseph Smith in that area.
Yeah.
Very good. So the rest of chapter 17, we unfortunately don't have enough time to do it justice. Basically, Nephi is building this ship, and Nephi is commanded to build a boat, and Nephi's older brothers say it will not float. If you remember the primary song, most of this chapter is Nephi exhorting them, chiding them, giving them a great big motivational sermon about how they are like the children of Israel, how they were led away from destruction, they are being led by God. God covenanted with our fathers. God is leading us. You guys are being just like those who reviled against Moses. Stop doing that. And then at the end of chapter 17, let's see, so verse 52, so Nephi said all these things, and enough that Laman and Lemuel were confounded and could not contend against me, and they didn't dare to touch Nephi, because Nephi had before saying that, if God commanded me to do all things, I could do them. He has such great power. So Laman and Lemuel are subdued by Nephi's power from the Spirit, from God. And then in verse 53, the Lord says, "Stretch forth thine hand again unto thy brethren, and they shall not wither before thee, but I will shock them," or shake them, "and this that I may do, that they may know that I am the Lord their God." And so that happened. Verse 55, they said, "We know of a surety that the Lord is with thee, because we know it is the power of the Lord that has shaken us." And they fell down before me and were about to worship Nephi, so they gathered exactly the wrong lesson from this, not to worship God, but instead to worship whoever was right in front of them who appeared to have power over them. Nephi set them straight immediately, saying, "No, don't do that. I'm your younger brother, but worship God, honor your father and your mother." Any thoughts about that? Really quick thoughts?
It reminds me a little bit of a statement that's been attributed to G.K. Chesterton, although he apparently didn't really say it, but he said some things like it, which is if you don't worship God, he says, you'll worship almost anything else. And here at Laman and Lemuel, who won't worship God, but oh boy, when they see some power, they're ready to drop down on their knees in front of their little brother. They're just their piety is disordered, to put it mildly. The other thing that occurs to me a little bit is, the temple is a link between worlds, between the lower world and the upper world, and so on. And it's often the plan of a temple is revealed to someone. The ship here serves almost that function. It's a link between the old world and the new world, between the old world and the land of promise. Its plan is revealed to Nephi in a dream. It's not built after the manner of ordinary ships, and so on. It seems to me, I don't want to push it too far, but there's kind of a temple echo in this, a divinely revealed pattern for building. In this case, not a temple, but a boat that will link the worlds and prove the method of salvation for the Lehite party.
There's a Noah theme there, isn't there? And Noah's Ark was definitely a temple, temple archetype.
Right.
Okay, so then going on in chapter 18, Nephi finishes the boat. They all get into the boat. The births really quick of Jacob and Joseph are mentioned. And then verses 8 and 9, it talks about as they set out on the sea, they are driven forth before the wind. Jeff, you had some thoughts about what that means.
Well, I won't say much because I think I mentioned earlier that the conjecture is Brant Gardner, for example, talks about the research that goes into this, that they launched during monsoon season in order to get the ballast they needed to go east, and it may even been during the El Nino cycle, just to give them a little bit of an extra push. There, by the way, being overcome by the waves and chaos, again, a very Noahic theme as well. God God shows His powers over the water by calming them, and it's disorder, waves and tempests and everything, versus God's ordering power would have been surely recognized, just like, again, Moses in the Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we have, it hasn't been too long since Laman and Lemuel were shocked by Nephi, and yet they get onto the boat. Verse 9, my brethren and the sons of Ishmael and also their wives began to make themselves merry, and to dance and to sing and to speak with much rudeness, and they did forget by what power they had been brought thither. Yea, they were lifted up unto exceeding rudeness. And the Liahona stops working, there's a big storm, they tie up Nephi, things are bad. and it's only when probably Lehi's wife pleads on his behalf that they let him go, and Nephi does steer the ship. And that was a very quick summary. Any other thoughts on chapter 18?
Well, I just wanted to say something about the word. They began to behave with much rudeness. I don't think we should take that as meaning that they were impolite. They were really not nice to Nephi. Rudeness here probably means crudeness or roughness, or something like that. So who knows exactly what they were doing. It wasn't just that they weren't being nice, they were being naughty. They were being crude, vulgar, rough, harsh in their language.
Yeah, and if we think of the Liahona as functioning basically like the gift of the Holy Ghost does for us, that if we forget what power is guiding and helping and sustaining us, forget God, and if we behave with crudeness and vulgarity, then the Spirit is not going to be with us and is not going to give us inspiration when we need it. So there you go, a type of that. We are running out of time. The rest of the lesson, they arrive in the Promised Land. Hooray. Verse 25 in chapter 18, when they get to the Promised Land, they find all manner of ore, gold and silver and copper, which is important for later on because Nephi, or right here in chapter 19, Nephi is going to make the plates, these plates, I believe, that we are reading the account therefrom. And then he writes down some of the words of Isaiah, talks about how important they are, how important it is to liken it to themselves. Chapters 20 and 21, he's quoting Isaiah. Chapter 22, and he says, now here's what Isaiah was talking about. Always nice to have a lovely interpretation and summation for you. It's part of the lesson, but the lesson manual doesn't go into it in so much detail, and neither will we. But before we end, are there any other thoughts about the rest of that?
Yeah, a few things I just want to say about Nephi looking at Isaiah. So, as I look at the Book of Mormon's, especially Nephi's utilization of Isaiah, I think this is a case where one of the weak things of the Book of Mormon has been made strong over time, right? This is Ether 12, what the Lord said he would do with the Book of Mormon. Because, the criticism has been and still is that Joseph Smith was just sort of slavishly plagiarizing the Bible, right? He just plopped open his King James Bible Isaiah and just either memorized it or copied it word for word as either as filler or, because he was kind of, I've heard one person suggest that he had run out of ideas, so he was kind of putting this in there to kind of, buy himself some time. Others have said, he wanted to sound more pious or whatever, and so he just sort of filled it with Isaiah. But this doesn't really work at all. And the reason for that, and I would recommend the work of Grant Hardy on this in particular, because Grant Hardy has some phenomenal work looking at the intertextuality of the Book of Mormon when it comes to Isaiah and other biblical books that Nephi is going to be quoting. But the level of sophistication and erudition that goes into Nephi's utilization of Isaiah is, I think, beyond anything Joseph Smith would have been capable of doing. He's not just quoting Isaiah. He's going to quote Isaiah, then he's going to give commentary on Isaiah, and within the commentary on Isaiah, he's going to silently re-quote the parts of Isaiah he's going to comment on. And it's going to be this very closely woven, very tightly crafted sort of quotation of and engaging with Isaiah by Nephi. So this isn't just somebody just sort of slavishly copying. This isn't just copy and pasting. This shows very careful engagement with Isaiah, quotation, paraphrasing, and sort of expansion on Isaiah. And that's the big thing Nephi is going to do. He's going to say, I liken Isaiah unto us, and so he's going to expand on it. He's going to give commentary. He's going to give application. He's going to give a discourse on it. And as opposed to being a weak thing for the Book of Mormon, I think it shows a level of sophistication, literary sophistication of the Book of Mormon that we haven't appreciated before. And thanks to the work of Grant Hardy and some others, Joseph Spencer is another scholar who's looked at this. Thanks to their work, we can now look at these Isaiah passages in the Book of Mormon, and we can appreciate them not just for the doctrine they teach, which is the most important, but for the aesthetic that they carry with them, right? The literary beauty and grace that comes with them. So I would just recommend the work of Grant Hardy and Joseph Spencer on this. They have some tremendous stuff on the Nephi's usage of Isaiah. And again, I think this is where we see something beyond Joseph Smith's capability, and I think it's a striking vindication for the Book of Mormon.
Thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I hope that this has been as great a lesson, discussion for all of you listening as it has been for us. If nothing else, you can take away from this that there is a ton of support for the Book of Mormon. There are so many good reasons to believe that it is true, that it happened, that these were real people who went on a real journey, and these things really happened. So thank you very much for joining us. This has been lesson number 5 in the Gospel Doctrine Book of Mormon manual. You can find this roundtable and many, many other excellent articles and resources at mormoninterpreter.com. Please feel free to leave comments or suggestions there and go searching for other good stuff to use in your teaching or ministry or for your own edification. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.